When to use Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication is a crucial decision for organizations looking to enhance the security and management of their Azure SQL databases. Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication allows users to connect to Azure SQL databases using their Azure Active Directory identities, providing a more streamlined and secure authentication process. To begin with, it is essential to understand the benefits of using Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication. This includes the ability to centrally manage identities and access, eliminate the need for redundant user accounts, and enhance security through features like multi-factor authentication and conditional access. One key concept to grasp is the difference between Azure SQL Authentication and Azure Active Directory Authentication. Azure SQL Authentication uses a username and password to connect to the database, whereas Azure Active Directory Authentication uses an Azure Active Directory identity to connect. So when should you use Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication? The answer is when you need to provide access to Azure SQL databases for a large number of users, or when you need to integrate Azure SQL with other Azure services that use Azure Active Directory. Practical examples of when to use Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication include providing access to Azure SQL databases for developers, data analysts, or other users who need to connect to the database using their Azure Active Directory identities. Another example is when integrating Azure SQL with other Azure services like Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, or Power BI, which all support Azure Active Directory Authentication. Best practices for implementing Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication include ensuring that Azure Active Directory is properly configured and that users have the necessary permissions to access the database. It is also essential to test the authentication process thoroughly to ensure that it works as expected. In conclusion, Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication is a powerful feature that provides a more secure and streamlined authentication process for Azure SQL databases. By understanding the benefits, key concepts, and practical examples of when to use Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication, organizations can make informed decisions about how to manage access to their Azure SQL databases and enhance the overall security of their Azure environment.